I've lived through my fair share of property mishaps over the past decade, but nothing could have prepared me for the day Karen decided she'd had enough of me, the very person who owns her house. It all started when I inherited an old but charming property in a quiet suburban neighborhood. I'd spent years refurbishing it, turning it into a comfortable home for a select few tenants. One of those tenants was Karen, a woman with a knack for stirring up drama and an unshakable belief that she knew better than everyone else. At first, Karen was just a typical renter, occasionally loud, a bit opinionated about the landscaping, and always ready to complain about something trivial. But as the months passed, her demands grew more outrageous. Karen began sending me passive-aggressive notes about everything from the wrong shade of the front door paint to the placement of my prized potted plants. I chalked it up to eccentricity. After all, everyone has quirks, right? That was until one crisp Monday morning when I found an envelope in my mailbox that made my heart skip a beat. It was addressed to me, in Karen's unmistakable scrawl, and it read like a formal eviction notice. My initial reaction was one of disbelief. I mean, who in their right mind sends an eviction notice when they're the one renting the house? I sat down with a cup of coffee and carefully read through the letter. Karen claimed that I was violating her right to peaceful enjoyment of the property and demanded that I vacate the premises within 30 days or face legal consequences. At that moment, I couldn't help but laugh out loud. Clearly, Karen was mixing up her roles. In every lease agreement I'd signed and in every clause of state law I knew, she was the tenant, not the property owner. But then, a spark of irritation set in. How dare she try to wield the power of eviction when she wasn't even entitled to it? Determined to get to the bottom of this madness, I dug out the lease documents from months ago. Sure enough, every page confirmed that I was the owner and Karen's responsibility was to pay rent and abide by the rules, not to send eviction notices to someone who owned the place. With my evidence in hand, I decided it was time for a face-to-face confrontation. That same afternoon, I walked over to Karen's front door, documents tucked safely in my folder. As I approached, I could see her in the yard, meticulously rearranging a row of flower pots, an action that, in her mind, must have symbolized keeping everything in order. When she noticed me, her expression shifted into a rehearsed mix of surprise and smug superiority. "So, you got my notice, huh?" she said, trying to sound casual yet defensive, as if she were delivering some hard truth rather than a blatant error in her role. I took a deep breath, smiling ever so slightly. "Karen, I did get your notice. And while I appreciate your concern for property standards, I think you've got it all backwards." I reached into my folder and pulled out the lease agreement, holding it out so she could see the fine print for herself. Her eyes darted over the document, and I could see the realization slowly dawning on her face. What is this?" she stammered, her tone faltering. "This, Karen, is the lease agreement you signed when you moved in," I explained gently. "It clearly states that I am the owner of this property. In other words, you're renting from me and not the other way around." For a moment, silence reigned. Then Karen's face flushed a deep shade of red, and she took a step back as if physically recoiling from the truth. "You can't be serious," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You wouldn't dare." "Oh, but I did," I replied, my tone a mix of amusement and firm resolve. "And let's not forget the multiple violations you've committed under your lease. Unauthorized modifications, disruptive behavior, and, yes, sending me a bogus eviction notice, none of which are your prerogative as a tenant." The tension in the air was palpable. I could almost hear the sound of her brain scrambling for some sort of legal loophole, a technicality that might salvage her misplaced authority. But no matter how much she searched, the facts were irrefutable. After our encounter, Karen didn't retreat quietly. Instead, she escalated her game by filing a formal complaint with the local authorities, insisting that I was attempting an unlawful eviction. That evening, just as I thought the day couldn't get any more surreal, 2 police officers arrived at my door. They were there to discuss Karen's complaint, an odd turn of events, considering the evidence at hand. I calmly presented them with every document in my possession, the signed lease, my correspondence with Karen, and even the absurd eviction notice. One officer, after a brief review, shook his head with a small smile. "Sir, you're in the clear. This is a landlord-tenant matter, and it's clear you're acting within your rights." The other officer added, "It's unfortunate that misunderstandings like this occur. We're not here to take sides, but rather to ensure everyone follows the law." With that, they left, reminding Karen that their role was strictly to handle emergencies, not personal squabbles. By the next morning, the situation had escalated beyond Karen's desperate attempts to justify her actions. I had filed a formal legal notice to terminate her lease for multiple violations, a process that, once set in motion, couldn't be stopped. Over the following weeks, Karen tried every trick in the book to stall the inevitable. She attempted to negotiate with me over the phone, sent countless emails demanding reconsideration, and even tried to rally support from a few disgruntled neighbors who, in her eyes, shared her grievances. Despite her frantic efforts, the legal process moved swiftly. On the day of the eviction, the tension in the neighborhood was almost tangible. I watched from a discreet distance as a team of law enforcement officers arrived at Karen's doorstep. With clipboards in hand and a stern look, they informed her that the court had ordered her to vacate the premises within 15 minutes. I stood there, heart pounding, as Karen's eyes darted around, her face a mixture of anger and disbelief. "This is my home," she cried out desperately, her voice trembling with panic. But the officers were unmoved by her protests. One of them stated firmly, "Ma'am, you signed a lease. The terms are clear, and you're in violation. Please gather your things and leave immediately." In that moment, I couldn't help but reflect on the absurdity of it all. Here was Karen, a woman who had spent months acting as if she were the authority, now being shown the door by the very law she had tried to manipulate. With a final, futile glare, Karen slung a single suitcase over her shoulder and stormed off, leaving behind a house filled with the echoes of her last desperate words. As the officers changed the locks and the reality of the situation set in, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of vindication and sorrow. Vindication, because the truth had prevailed. Sorrow, because it was disheartening to see someone so consumed by entitlement lose everything they once took for granted. Later that day, while reviewing some paperwork in my office, I received an unexpected email from a local property management firm. They had heard about the debacle and were intrigued by how I had handled the situation. Their message was simple: "If you're ever looking to expand your property portfolio, we'd love to work with you." I chuckled softly to myself. Apparently, Karen's downfall had inadvertently opened a door to new opportunities. Now, whenever I tell the story at gatherings or on my YouTube channel, I always emphasize the lesson learned: entitlement and arrogance can only take you so far. No matter how loudly you shout or how hard you try to bend the rules, the law and common sense will always have the final say. And if you ever find yourself in a situation where someone is trying to evict you for reasons that just don't add up, just remember, sometimes the tables can turn in the most unexpected ways. So here's to knowing your rights, standing your ground, and never underestimating the power of the truth, even if it means watching someone as stubborn as Karen finally come to terms with reality.